The argument had been building for 3 days, and it finally exploded on a Tuesday afternoon in the middle of Mason Pruitt's front yard, with the summer sun bearing down like a judgment from God and half the ranch hands pretending not to watch from the fence line. "You have no right to sell that water access to the Dalton brothers." Clara Holt's voice cracked across the yard like a whip, her dark eyes blazing, one hand gripping the deed she had ridden 2 hours to retrieve from the county recorder's office. "That creek runs along the boundary of my property too, and my cattle have been drinking from it since before you ever set foot in this county." Mason stood his ground, thumbs hooked in his belt, watching her with those quiet gray eyes that never seemed to move as fast as the rest of the world. He was 31 years old, broad-shouldered, with dust on his hat and a jaw that hadn't seen a razor since Sunday. He had been ranching the Pruitt land since he was 19, and he had seen thunderstorms that rattled the whole valley. Clara Holt was something else entirely. "You are absolutely right," he said. She stopped. Her mouth, which had been forming the next artillery round, went still. "What? You are right. I had no business making that arrangement without consulting you first. I will send word to the Daltons today and have the agreement dissolved." Clara stared at him. The wind lifted the edge of her riding skirt. One of the ranch hands by the fence coughed into his fist. "That is all you have to say?" she demanded. "What else would you like me to say?" She had ridden 2 hours in the heat with a legal document and a speech prepared to last 45 minutes. She had practiced the speech in her head the entire ride, imagining every possible defense he might throw up, planning her counterattack for each one. She had been ready for a war. He had simply handed her the flag. "I want you to explain yourself," she said, her voice still sharp but losing some of its edge, like a knife that has cut through something unexpectedly soft. "I was trying to secure water rights against the drought we are heading into," he said. "I made a deal I should not have made unilaterally. You called me on it. You were right. I am correcting it." She looked down at the deed in her hand, then back up at him. Something about the way he stood there, calm and unhurried, not defensive, not wounded, just genuinely listening, made her feel like she had charged through a door that was already open and stumbled into an empty room. "Fine," she said finally, shoving the deed into her saddlebag. "Fine. Then we are in agreement." She mounted her horse with the dignity of someone who had intended to win, and she rode back down his lane toward the county road, and she tried very hard not to think about the way his eyes had followed her the whole way. She had no way of knowing, not yet, not for months, that he had dissolved that Dalton agreement before she even arrived. He had sent the rider at dawn. He had known she was coming. He had simply wanted to hear what she had to say. That was the first argument Clara Holt won against Mason Pruitt. It would not be the last. The year was 1878, and the Texas Panhandle was a place that tested people the way a blacksmith tests iron, with heat and pressure and the constant threat of breaking. The town of Callow Creek sat at the edge of the caprock, a collection of unpainted buildings and stubborn people who had decided that this particular stretch of hard country was worth the suffering it cost to live in it. Clara had arrived in Callow Creek 4 years earlier, at 22, with her father's coffin on the back of a wagon and the deed to his failing ranch in her coat pocket. Everyone in town had expected her to sell the Holt land within the year and go back east, back to her mother's people in Tennessee, back to civilization. She had fooled them all. She had rebuilt the Holt operation the hard way, learning things that women in that era were not supposed to need to know: how to read a water table, how to negotiate cattle prices at market, how to calculate the carrying capacity of a pasture against the weight gain of a mixed herd. She had hired 2 Mexican vaqueros named Esteban and Luis, who had worked cattle in Chihuahua, and knew more about range management than most of the Anglo ranchers in the county. And she had paid them fairly and treated them with respect at a time when neither of those things was common, and they had repaid her with fierce loyalty. She had also developed a reputation in Callow Creek for being difficult. The men at the bank called her stubborn. The cattlemen at the association meetings said she was combative. The women in town thought she was throwing her life away on a doomed venture when she ought to be finding a husband. Clara did not lose sleep over any of these opinions. What she did lose sleep over was the Pruitt operation. Mason Pruitt's ranch shared a long border with the Holt land, and the two properties were constantly generating points of friction, the kind of small territorial disputes that are inevitable when two ambitious operations run up against each other in tight country. Water access, fence lines, grazing boundaries, cattle that drifted across survey markers. Every season brought a new negotiation, and Clara had learned early that Mason Pruitt was a maddeningly reasonable person to argue with. She had expected him to be like the other men she dealt with in that county, dismissive, condescending, inclined to explain things she already knew and dismiss the things she said as female emotion rather than legitimate grievance. She had prepared herself for that kind of opposition. Mason was nothing like that. He listened to her. Every time he listened, he asked questions that showed he had heard her previous points. And then he either agreed with her, which was infuriating in its simplicity, or he offered a compromise so fair that refusing it would make her look unreasonable. It was the most confusing experience of her adult life. The water access argument was in the spring of 1878. By that summer, they had crossed paths at least a dozen more times, drawn together by the simple geography of neighboring properties and the relentless business of survival in the Panhandle. The dispute about the fence line along the north pasture came in June. Clara had discovered that someone, she suspected Mason's crew, had shifted a section of fence approximately 40 yards into what she believed was Holt territory. She had ridden out with her survey notes and found Mason already there, studying the line with a weathered theodolite and a folded map. "Your fence is 40 yards too far east," she said, pulling up beside him. He looked at the instrument, then at the map, then at her. "You are right. The original survey was off. The legal boundary puts this fence well within your property. I will have my men move it by Friday." She had expected a negotiation. She had brought documentation. She sat on her horse looking at the space where the argument was supposed to have happened and felt it dissolving under her like morning frost. "Friday," she repeated, "or sooner if it is causing you immediate trouble." She told him Friday was fine and rode away with the peculiar hollow feeling of someone who has aimed at a target that moved at the last moment. The fence was moved by Thursday. In July, there was the matter of the Pruitt bulls getting through a downed gate and breeding with 3 of her best heifers before anyone noticed. This was the kind of thing that started feuds in that country. Clara rode to the Pruitt ranch with fire in her eyes and a prepared argument about property damage and genetic interference with her breeding program. Mason met her at the gate with his hat in his hand. "I heard this morning," he said. "I am genuinely sorry." "Those 3 heifers, what were you planning for them? I want to make sure you do not take a loss from this." She told him she had been planning to sell them as grade stock and keep the calves, aiming for a specific bloodline she was developing. He thought about it for exactly 30 seconds. "I will replace them with 3 comparable heifers from my own herd and give you the choice of any bull from my breeding stock to use at no charge for the next 2 seasons. That should keep your program on track." It was more than she had planned to ask for. "That is a generous offer," she said, and she heard the suspicion in her own voice. He looked at her then, directly, the way he sometimes did that made her feel like he was reading something just below the surface of her face. "Why would I be anything but generous?" he said. "You are the one who was wronged." She had not had a good answer for that. She still did not. There were other people in her life who complicated her feelings about Mason Pruitt. Martha Geary ran the general store in Callow Creek with her husband Frank, and she was Clara's closest friend in the county. A woman of 45 who had survived a cholera year and a difficult marriage, and come through both with a dry wit and an extremely accurate sense of human character. "That man watches you," Martha said one afternoon in August when Clara had stopped in for lamp oil and coffee and found herself lingering at the counter longer than necessary. "He watches everyone," Clara said. "He is observant." "He watches you different," Martha said. "Frank watches the door when he thinks I might walk in any minute. It looks like that." Clara measured coffee into a paper sack and did not answer. "He came in last week," Martha continued, completely undeterred, "and asked me what kind of fabric you had been looking at. Said he was wondering if there was something useful he could do for you since you had mentioned needing curtains for the bunkhouse." Clara's hand stilled on the counter. "I told him you had been looking at the blue cotton," Martha said, "and he bought 20 yards of it and had it delivered to your ranch with a note that said it was a neighborly gesture." Clara thought about the blue cotton sitting in her storeroom, which she had assumed came from some county relief program she had inadvertently been enrolled in. "He bought it himself, anonymously," Martha said with great satisfaction, "but he was not as anonymous as he thought he was." Clara rode home with her coffee and her lamp oil, and a new and deeply unsettling piece of information that she tucked into the back of her mind and tried very hard not to examine. It was not easy to ignore Mason Pruitt when he kept doing things like that. The autumn of 1878 brought a new complication in the form of Garrett Dalton, the elder of the two Dalton brothers, who had been quietly acquiring land and water rights throughout the county, and who had decided, apparently, that Clara's resistance to his expansion was a personal affront rather than a simple business decision. Garrett Dalton was 35, good-looking in the way of men who know they are and rely on it, and he had a manner that many women in Callow Creek found charming and that Clara found exhausting. He had approached her twice about buying a portion of her eastern pasture, the piece with the best well access, and she had declined both times clearly and completely. He showed up at her ranch on a Thursday in October with a third offer that was significantly higher than the market value, and a smile that suggested he expected the money to settle the matter. "I understand why you have hesitated," he said, sitting in her front room with his hat on his knee. "But I think when you look at these numbers with a clear head, you will see that I am offering you a fair exit from a venture that has been costing you far more than it is making you." Clara set his paper down on the table. "I am not looking for an exit. I am looking to expand. Miss Holt." He leaned forward slightly, dropping his voice to the register men used when they wanted to sound like they were sharing a confidence. "This is hard country. The drought we are heading into is going to break a lot of smaller operations. I would hate to see you caught short when it turns." "I appreciate your concern," she said, in a tone that indicated she did not. "The answer is still no." He left without pushing further, but something in the set of his mouth as he walked to his horse told her that this was not finished. She mentioned it to Esteban that evening while they were checking the well levels, not because she was frightened, but because Esteban had a talent for reading situations before they ripened into problems. Esteban was quiet for a moment, looking at the water line in the well. "He has been talking to people at the stockyards," he said. "Lewis heard it last week. He is trying to find out who holds notes on the smaller ranches." That was information worth having. Clara filed it away alongside the blue cotton and Mason Pruitt's quiet eyes, and the growing sense that the board she was playing on was larger than she had thought. The next argument with Mason happened at a cattle association meeting in November, and it was the first one she was not entirely sure she won. The association had been debating the construction of a communal water tank on the south side of the county, a project that made obvious sense given the drought projections, but that required a collective contribution of labor and materials that several of the smaller operations were resistant to. Mason had proposed a tiered contribution system based on herd size. Clara had proposed a flat contribution with the option for labor exchange in lieu of materials for those who could not afford the cash outlay. They had argued for 40 minutes in front of 12 other ranchers and the association secretary, and at the end of it, Mason had said, "I think Miss Holt's proposal is actually more equitable. I withdraw mine in favor of hers." The room had gone quiet in the way that happened when something unexpected occurred. Clara had won. The association adopted her proposal unanimously. She rode home thinking about it, turning it over, looking at it from every angle. He had not been wrong to yield. Her proposal was better. But there was something about the way he yielded that nagged at her, something too easy, too certain, as if he had already looked at the problem from her angle before she even arrived. Later, she would think back to that November meeting and recognize it as the moment the question started forming, the question she was not yet ready to ask. December in the Texas Panhandle was a particular kind of cold, the kind that came in fast from the northwest and turned the world into something unforgiving. Clara was in her barn at 6 in the morning on a Wednesday when one of her mares went into early labor, and she was so focused on the foal that she did not notice the rider in her yard until Esteban came in and said, "Mason Pruitt is outside." She looked up from the straw. "What does he want?" "He says he was riding the boundary and saw lights, wanted to make sure everything was all right." She thought about this for a moment. It was 20 degrees outside and the boundary was 3 miles away. "Tell him he can come in if he wants to be useful," she said, "but I am not leaving this horse." He came in, shed his coat on a hook by the door, rolled up his sleeves, and spent the next 2 hours helping her bring that foal into the world without being asked what to do, and without telling her what she should be doing differently. He simply read the situation and moved to where he was needed, and when it was done and the foal was standing on its shaking legs and the mare was licking it clean, he leaned back against the stall wall with his forearms on his knees and looked at it with an expression she had never seen on a man's face before. It was the expression of someone who found that particular moment, a new life in the cold and the straw and the lamplight, genuinely wonderful. "She is going to be a fine horse," he said. "She is," Clara agreed. They were sitting in her barn in the early morning, and the cold was keeping the world very quiet outside, and without the structure of a dispute between them, there was something else in the air that Clara did not know what to do with. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask me anything." The association meeting in November. "Your proposal was not actually worse than mine. The numbers came out about the same either way. Why did you withdraw it?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the foal. "Because yours was better in a way the numbers did not show. Mine was efficient. Yours was fair. Those are not always the same thing." She looked at him. "And," he said, still watching the foal, "you had been fighting for that proposal for 40 minutes against people who were not listening to you the way they should have been. It was worth something to have the room here that you were right." Clara sat with that. The fire in the small stove at the end of the barn ticked and settled. Outside, the wind moved along the walls of the building. "You wanted them to hear that I was right," she said. "Yes." "Rather than just finding the middle ground." "Yes." She did not have another question after that. They sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence that is not uncomfortable. And eventually he stood up and took his coat from the hook and said good morning in a quiet voice and rode back out into the cold. She sat in the straw with the new foal and her mother, and thought about a man who had ridden 3 miles in 20-degree weather on a Wednesday morning, because he saw lights in her barn and was concerned, and who had stayed 2 hours and asked for nothing, and said 3 sentences about fairness that went straight to the center of her chest like a needle finding a seam. She named the foal December. January brought the threat that had been building since Garrett Dalton's October visit crystallized into something concrete. Clara received a letter from the county land office informing her that there was a challenge filed against the survey of her eastern pasture boundary, the disputed section that happened to contain the primary well access for that portion of her range. The challenge had been filed by a land speculation firm out of Amarillo, and when she sent Esteban to Amarillo to look into it, he came back with the name of the principal investor in that firm, Garrett Dalton. The hearing was scheduled for February. Clara rode to the county seat with her survey records and her deed and 3 days' worth of furious preparation, and in the courtroom waiting room she found Mason Pruitt sitting with his own survey records and a witness she had not expected. "What are you doing here?" she asked. "Your eastern boundary is also my western boundary," he said. "If someone is challenging your survey, they are challenging mine too." This was technically true. She had not thought of it. "I have a surveyor from Austin," he said. "William Cates. He did the original Caprock surveys in '71. I wired him last month when I heard about the challenge being prepared." She stared at him. "You heard about it last month?" "Yes." "You did not tell me." He met her eyes. "I was building the response. I wanted to give you something useful rather than just alarm." She was so angry she could not speak for a moment. She stood in the waiting room of the county courthouse with her briefcase and her fury, and looked at this infuriating, considerate, impossible man who had been quietly protecting her flank for a month without telling her. "I had the right to know," she said. "You are absolutely right," he said without flinching. "I should have told you immediately. I was wrong to keep it from you, and I am sorry." She looked at him for a long moment. She was waiting for him to defend himself, to explain why his judgment had been better than hers would have been, to suggest that her reaction was disproportionate. He did none of those things. He just apologized and held her gaze and waited. "Your surveyor is going to testify for my claim," she said. "For both claims, but yours first because yours is the primary dispute." The hearing went in her favor. William Cates was 70 years old and had the kind of certainty that came from decades of precision work, and his testimony demolished the challenge so thoroughly that the Dalton firm's representative declined to offer a rebuttal. The judge dismissed the challenge with costs against the filing party. In the courthouse hallway afterward, Clara found Mason speaking quietly with the county recorder, a man named Horace Webb, who had been in that office since before Clara was born, and who had a reputation for being extremely careful about which disputes he allowed to proceed. She waited until Mason had finished. "Thank you," she said when they were alone in the corridor, "for the surveyor. It was the right thing to do. You could have used this as leverage," she said. "You could have let the challenge proceed and then come to me with a deal. Trade your help for the water access you wanted in the spring." He looked at her with an expression she could not fully interpret. "Clara," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name without the miss in front of it, not disrespectfully, but with a kind of quiet directness that was entirely different. "That is not how I do things." She believed him. That was the most unsettling part. She believed him completely. February became March, and the drought that Garrett Dalton had predicted and tried to profit from began to tighten its grip on the Panhandle. The creeks dropped. The wells went shallow. The grass came up thin and pale in the pastures. Clara's communal water tank proposal, adopted by the association in November, was now being implemented, and the timing of it was the difference between survival and ruin for at least 4 smaller operations in the southern portion of the county. At the April association meeting, when it was clear that her proposal had saved those operations, there was a moment when Thomas Wren, one of the older ranchers who had been skeptical of the plan from the start, stood up and said that the county owed Miss Holt a significant debt for her foresight. The room agreed. Everyone looked at her. She looked across the table at Mason, who was watching her with that quiet expression she had been cataloging for a year now, and she thought about how at the November meeting he had withdrawn his competing proposal without a word of hesitation, and she thought about the blue cotton in her storeroom, and she thought about December the foal and the morning in the barn when he had said that efficiency and fairness were not always the same thing. She began to understand slowly, like a person walking into a room where the curtains have been half drawn, that there was a pattern here. That every argument she had won not because she had been better prepared or more determined, though she had always been both, but because he had let her win. Not out of condescension, not because he thought her arguments were weak and he was humoring her, but because he had seen her, seen what the arguments meant to her, seen that she was fighting in a world that refused to listen to her, and he had listened. He had always listened. She did not say any of this at the April meeting. She accepted Thomas Wren's compliment with grace and turned the conversation back to the water distribution schedule for the coming summer. But she carried the thought home with her and sat with it on the porch that evening, watching the sky go the color of copper over the caprock, thinking about what it meant to be loved by someone who never once made you feel small for needing to win. Because that was what it was. She knew it now. She was not ready to know what to do with it. In May, Garrett Dalton made his final move. He had been quiet since the survey challenge failed, but quiet in the way that certain predators are quiet, not retreating but repositioning. He arrived at Clara's ranch one afternoon, not with an offer this time, but with a proposition of a different kind. He asked her to marry him. She was so startled that she said nothing for a full 10 seconds, which he apparently took as encouragement, because he continued talking about the benefits of combining their operations, the efficiency it would create, the security it would provide her against future challenges of the kind he had only recently stopped funding, though he did not say that last part aloud. "No," she said. "I think if you consider the practicalities." "No," she said again, in a voice that did not invite further discussion. He left without the grace he had shown in October. There was something colder in his face now, something that had given up on patience. She watched him ride away and felt the hair on the back of her neck do something that hair does when instinct has registered danger before the conscious mind has caught up. She told Esteban to make sure the gates were latched at night. 3 days later, someone cut her fence line along the northern pasture and drove 30 of her cattle onto the road in the middle of the night. She was up by 3 in the morning with Esteban and Lewis and 2 other hands, riding in darkness to recover the scattered herd. And when dawn came, she found the fence section not just broken but deliberately destroyed, with a specific quality to the cutting that told her it had not been an accident or an opportunist. She was standing in the wreckage of it, calculating costs and fury in equal measure, when she heard hooves and turned to find Mason coming up the county road with 4 of his men. "I saw the dust," he said. "What happened?" She showed him the fence line. He crouched by the cut wire, looking at it the way he had looked at everything, carefully, without rushing to a conclusion. He did not say that Garrett Dalton had done this, but the question was in his eyes when he looked up at her. "He came to the ranch on Monday," she said. Something moved through Mason's expression. Not anger exactly, or not just anger, something more complicated and more controlled. What did he want? He proposed marriage. A silence that was its own kind of sentence. What did you tell him? "No," she said, "in terms I thought were quite clear." Mason stood up. He was looking at the cut fence and not at her, and she could see him doing the thing he did when he was working through a problem, weighing it, turning it, finding all the edges. "There is a cattle inspector coming through the county next week," he said. "Harlan Pruitt, out of Austin. He investigates livestock crimes. He has jurisdiction that the county sheriff does not. You know him. We grew up together. I can wire him today." She looked at him. "You do not have to get involved in this." "Yes, I do," he said, and the simplicity of it, the complete lack of hesitation, hit her somewhere below the breastbone and stayed there. The cattle inspector came. He was a lean, serious man named Harlan Pruitt, who spoke very little and observed everything. And within 4 days, he had documentation connecting the fence cutting and the cattle drive to a hired hand recently employed by the Dalton operation. It was not enough to file criminal charges against Garrett Dalton directly. The connection was one step removed, but it was enough to cause the kind of professional embarrassment that had consequences in that world. 2 weeks later, Garrett Dalton announced he was selling his Callow Creek properties and relocating his operation to the eastern part of the state. Martha Geary told Clara about it over the counter of the general store, with the particular satisfaction of someone delivering very good news. "He is gone, or he will be by the end of summer. Frank heard it from the land agent this morning." Clara bought her coffee and her lamp oil and stood in the doorway of the store, feeling the particular kind of relief that only follows a sustained threat. "You should tell Mason," Martha said. Clara looked back at her. "He asked about you the day after the fence business. Came in here with this look on his face like a man who is trying very hard not to look worried about something." Martha was folding a bolt of cloth but watching Clara with her sharp eyes. "You know what that man is doing, do you not?" "I am beginning to," Clara said. "Then perhaps you might let him know that you know." She went home and thought about it for 2 weeks. It was not that she was afraid of what she felt. She had stopped being afraid of her own feelings a long time ago, somewhere in that first bitter year of learning to run the Holt operation after her father died. Fear was a luxury she had not had. What she felt for Mason Pruitt was not fear exactly, but it was something that required the same kind of reckoning, because she had spent 4 years building a life on the principle that she did not need anyone's permission to do what she was capable of doing. She had fought for every inch of that life against people who told her she was wrong to try. And the man across the fence line had been watching the whole time quietly, and not once had he told her she was wrong. He had just made sure she had room to be right. She thought about what that meant about who he was, and what it meant about how she had been reading him. She had thought, in the beginning, that his reasonableness was tactical, a way of avoiding conflict that served his own interests. She had thought the yielding was either weakness or manipulation. She had been looking for the hidden motive, the trap, the moment when his helpfulness would reveal itself as a form of control. It had never come. What had come instead was consistency. A man who showed up when there was trouble in her barn and did not ask for credit. A man who prepared a legal defense for her claim and apologized for not telling her sooner. A man who withdrew his own perfectly acceptable proposal in a public meeting because he wanted the room to hear that she was right. A man who had bought 20 yards of blue cotton and called it a neighborly gesture and not mentioned it once. She rode to the Pruitt ranch on a Tuesday in June, which felt appropriate given that Tuesdays seemed to be when the most consequential things happened between them. She found him at the corral, working with a young horse, the kind of patient, repetitive groundwork that could not be hurried. He saw her coming and kept working with the horse until she had dismounted and tied her mare at the post, giving her the time she needed and the space she needed and not treating her arrival as an emergency. She leaned on the corral fence and watched him. After a few minutes, he let the young horse go and came to the fence and leaned on the other side of it, arms across the top rail, looking at her. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "I know why you always let me win," she said. The early summer light was coming in from the west, and it was warm on the corral posts and on the dust and on his face as he listened. "At first I thought you were humoring me," she said. "Then I thought you were being strategic. Then I thought I was imagining the whole pattern and it was just coincidence." She paused. "It was not coincidence." "No," he said. "It was not. The water access deal, you dissolved it before I arrived." He was very still. "Martha told me about the blue cotton," she said. "I know that was you." He exhaled slowly and looked at the horizon for a moment, then back at her. "I did not want you to feel like a charity case. I just saw that you needed it, and I wanted to do something useful." "You have been doing useful things for a year," she said, very quietly, and then standing back and letting me think I had taken care of them myself. "You had taken care of most of them yourself. I just removed a few obstacles. Mason." She stopped. It was the first time she had said his name without the distance of formality, and it landed differently than she expected, warm and immediate. "Why?" He looked at her steadily. "Because you were right about most things, and when you were not entirely right, you were not entirely wrong either. And because watching you fight a world that does not want to listen to you was the most frustrating thing I have ever witnessed, and if I could make it less of a fight, I wanted to do that." "And the other part," she said. "What other part?" She held his gaze. "The part that is not just about what is fair." He was quiet for a long moment. The young horse moved somewhere behind him, and a mockingbird made noise in the scrub oak by the barn, and the world was very specific and present around them. "I have been in love with you since the spring of '77, he said. That was before the water access argument, before we had ever spoken more than 2 sentences to each other. You were riding the south fence line on a gray horse in a rainstorm, and you stopped and read a survey marker in the rain, just crouched down in the mud and rain to read it, like there was no weather at all, because you needed the information." He paused. "I have never seen anyone take the world so seriously." She could feel something happening in her chest that she did not have a word for, something that was not quite familiar from any previous experience. "You should have told me," she said. "I know. You have been loving me around the edges of a fence line for over a year." "Yes. That is not practical." "No," he agreed, "it is not." She was quiet for a moment, looking at him across the corral rail, this steady, patient, quietly remarkable man who had spent a year making room for her to be exactly who she was. "The argument is that you should have just told me," she said. He looked at her, and there was a quality of attention in it that she had been trying to describe to herself for months and could finally name. It was tenderness, completely unself-conscious, entirely genuine tenderness. "You are right," he said softly. "I should have told you." She laughed. It came out unexpected, startled out of her by the sheer consistency of him, and it was a real laugh, full and warm, and his face changed when he heard it. "You are doing it again," she said. "I know," he said. "But I am also in love with you, and those 2 things are going to be true at the same time for the rest of my life." She looked at him. She thought about the fence lines and the water arguments and the blue cotton and the foal in the cold barn and the courthouse hallway, and all the small moments that had been accumulating for a year like stones in a cairn, marking the path that had led here, to this corral fence in the June sunshine in Callow Creek, Texas, 1879. "Then you had better come around to this side of the fence," she said. He did. He walked around the end of the corral and came to stand in front of her, close enough that she had to look up slightly to meet his eyes, and she put her hands on his forearms on the rail beside her and said, "I have been in love with you since December." He asked, "The month or the foal?" "Both," she said, "but mostly you." He kissed her, and it was nothing like the first kisses in the novels she had read in Tennessee as a girl, which had always seemed to involve a great deal of trembling and swooning. It was quiet and deliberate and completely certain, the way he was about everything, and it felt exactly like coming home to a place she had not known she was looking for. They stood by the corral in the June light for a long time, and eventually his hands were in her hair, and her face was against his shoulder, and neither of them was in any particular hurry to be anywhere else. "I want to say something," she said, her voice slightly muffled against his shoulder. "All right. I have been winning arguments with you for over a year. Yes. I am not going to stop just because we are in love." He made a sound against the top of her head that was unambiguously a laugh. "I would be genuinely worried if you did." She pulled back to look at him. "But I want real arguments," she said. "Not surrenders. If I am wrong about something, I want you to tell me. I do not need to be protected from being wrong." He looked at her. She could see him taking this seriously, not dismissing it or laughing it off. "I hear you," he said. "Honestly, most of the time you were right. But when you are not, I will tell you. Promise me." "I promise you." She believed him. They told no one immediately, which in a town the size of Callow Creek meant that Martha Geary knew within 3 days. She came into the general store to buy nails and found Martha watching her with an expression of supreme satisfaction, and she said, "Who told you?" "Nobody told me anything," Martha said. "You just look different." "I look exactly the same." "You look like a woman who has stopped arguing with herself about something," Martha said. "It is very becoming." Mason came to the Holt ranch for Sunday dinner at the end of June, the first time since the morning with December the foal that he had been inside her house for reasons that were not strictly business. Esteban and Louis, who were sharper observers than they let on, were extremely polite about it, which was their way of approving. Clara had cooked a leg of lamb that had taken most of the morning, and had turned out well enough that she was only moderately anxious about it. And Mason had brought a bottle of wine that came from a supply he had apparently been saving for an occasion he was willing to acknowledge only as something he had been hoping for. They ate at her table in the evening light, and he told her about his first year on the Pruitt land, which he had taken over at 19 when his father died, and how afraid he had been in that first winter when the cattle prices dropped and the well went dry, and there had been a week when he genuinely was not sure he was going to survive the experience. "What kept you going?" she asked. "Stubbornness," he said, "and the unwillingness to give other people the satisfaction of being right about my failure." She recognized that motivation intimately. "Who told you that you would fail?" "Everyone with any sense," he said. 19 is too young. The land is too dry. The market is too uncertain. Pick the reason." He refilled her glass. "I kept a list of everyone who told me I should give up, and every morning I read the list and it made me angry enough to work another day." She smiled. "I had a list too. I know, I saw it." She looked at him. "You saw my list. You left it on the association meeting table in October of 77. I did not mean to see it, but it was facing up and I read the first 3 names before I realized what it was." "What did you do?" "I put it face down," he said, "and I thought about those 3 men and what they had said to you, and I was very irritated for the rest of the afternoon." She looked at her wine glass. That list had 12 names on it. I only saw 3. The 3 were irritating enough. 12 would have been catastrophic. He laughed, and she watched him laugh and thought about how strange it was that a person could know someone for over a year through the formal medium of disputes and professional interaction, and then discover, in the course of a single evening, that they were funny and self-aware and had been angry on her behalf at men who had dismissed her, and that all of this had been there the whole time, just waiting for the fence to come down. After dinner, they sat on her porch in the warm evening, listening to the caprock settle, and he asked her what her plans were for the expansion she had mentioned in October. She told him. She had been thinking about it for 2 years, adding a second well, expanding the north pasture through an agreement with a landowner to the west, who was looking to reduce his operation, developing a more systematic breeding program that could produce cattle for a premium market rather than just grade stock. He listened to all of it without interrupting, and when she finished he said, "The landowner to the west is Samuel Finch. He owes me a favor from a cattle deal in '75. I can introduce you if you want." "What is the favor?" "A significant one." She thought about it. "All right. But I want to negotiate the terms myself." "Of course. And I will tell him directly that you arranged the introduction. I do not want him thinking it was his idea." Mason looked at her. "Why does that matter?" "Because it is honest," she said. "And because, if he knows the introduction came from you, he will understand that I am someone worth dealing with seriously. And I would rather have that on the table than have him discover it afterward and feel managed." He was quiet for a moment. "You know," he said, "that is better than how I would have done it. I am often better than how you would have done it." "Yes," he said without a trace of irony, "you are." She looked at him in the fading evening light. "See," she said softly, "that one I want you to argue with me about." "I cannot," he said. "It is true, Mason." "Clara." They sat in the warm dark, and she leaned her shoulder against his, and he put his arm around her, and it was the most uncomplicated she had felt in 4 years. They announced their engagement in August of 1879, which surprised no one in Callow Creek, except for the people who had expected Mason Pruitt to remain a bachelor, because he was too quiet and too self-contained and too unlikely to be worked up about any woman, and who had not been watching closely enough. Martha Geary gave a small celebration at the store with cake and cider, which was attended by most of the town. And Thomas Wren made a speech about the benefits of neighboring ranches working together that managed to be both correct and entirely beside the point. The wedding was in October, at the Holt Ranch, because Clara's family deed had been on that land for 4 years, and the land was hers, and that fact was going to be acknowledged by the occasion. It was a small ceremony, conducted by the Methodist minister who came through Callow Creek on his circuit, attended by Esteban and Lewis and their families, Martha and Frank Geary, Thomas Wren and a handful of other association members, and Harlan Pruitt the cattle inspector, who had come back through the county on his circuit, and who apparently thought this was worth staying an extra 3 days for. Clara wore her mother's dress, altered to fit her, cream-colored and practical and completely herself. Mason wore his best coat and had shaved that morning, which was more ceremony than he usually accorded a Tuesday, and which made Esteban and Lewis exchange a glance of great amusement. The minister asked the usual questions and they gave the usual answers, and when Mason kissed her, brief and certain, the way he did everything, there was a sound from the small, gathered group that was not quite applause and not quite laughter, but something between the two. The sound of people who have watched 2 people belong to each other from a distance and are relieved to finally see it acknowledged officially. After, when most of the guests had gone and the lamps were lit in the Holt ranch house, and they were alone for the first time as husband and wife, Clara stood in the kitchen doorway looking at the table that still had the remnants of the celebration on it, and Mason came up behind her and stood close, not touching, waiting. "Well," she said. "Well," he said, "we are married. We are." "I have something to tell you," she said. "All right." "I am terrified," she said. "Not of you, not of this, but of the size of what this is, of how much it matters." He put his hands on her shoulders, gently, from behind, and she felt him lean forward until his chin was near her temple. "I have been terrified of this since October of '77, he said quietly. "When I read the first 3 names on your list, and realized I was in extremely serious trouble." She turned to face him. "You knew then?" "I knew something was happening that I was not going to be able to reason my way out of, which was concerning because reasoning is usually my best strategy." She was laughing again, the helpless kind, and she put both hands on his chest and he folded his arms around her, and she thought that this was it. This was what people meant when they talked about finding the person who fit alongside the shape of your life, not completing it, because she was complete, but extending it into a direction she had not known was available. They combined the ranches not by merging the deeds, but by creating a joint operating agreement that Clara had drawn up with a lawyer from Amarillo. One that gave her clear ownership of the Holt property in perpetuity and him clear ownership of the Pruitt property, with shared rights to the combined range and shared responsibility for all operating decisions requiring mutual agreement. It was an unusual arrangement for 1879. The lawyer had spent 20 minutes explaining to Clara that, under Texas law, she did not actually need this kind of agreement, that her husband would automatically take stewardship of her property upon marriage, and that the document she was asking him to draft was legally redundant. Clara had looked at him with a patience she did not entirely feel and said, "I understand what the law says. I am telling you what the agreement will say. They are 2 different documents and I need the second one." The lawyer had drafted the document. Mason signed it without reading every line, which annoyed her, and she told him so. And he said he had read the draft twice when she sent it to him last week, and he had no objections to any of it. And she said that was not the point. And he asked what the point was. And she said that in a negotiation you should always read the final document regardless of what you agreed to in draft, because things change. He read the final document. It had not changed from the draft. He signed it. "You were right," he said. "I know." He looked at her with that expression that she now knew was not just thoughtfulness, but was a specific flavor of love, the kind that finds a person's most characteristic quality to be also their most endearing quality. "I am keeping that list," he said. "What list?" "Of the times you are right. I started it in October of '77, and I intend to keep it for the rest of my life." She stared at him. "That is either the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me or the most alarming." "Both," he said, and she let him have it. The winter of 1879 going into 1880 was the harshest the Panhandle had seen in a decade, but the combined Pruitt-Holt operation, and Clara always insisted on both names in that order because alphabetical was logical, and also because the Holt name had earned its place in that county, was better prepared for it than most of their neighbors. The water tank system Clara had proposed at the association meeting held through the worst of it. 3 smaller operations that would have broken in the drought were still running by spring. Clara spent the winter working on the breeding program she had been planning for 2 years, and Mason spent it improving the well infrastructure on the northern range with a hydraulic pump system he had been researching since the summer. And Esteban and Louis spent it arguing cheerfully about the best method for winter feed storage, and coming up with a solution that combined both of their approaches and was better than either one individually. In March of 1880, when the worst of the winter was breaking and the first thin grass was coming up in the south pasture, Clara told Mason that she was pregnant. She told him in the kitchen at 6 in the morning while she was making coffee, because she was not a person who needed elaborate settings for important information, and because she had already been sitting with it for a week while she made sure she was right about what she was observing, and she was right. He went very still in the way he did when something was larger than his usual response had scale for. Then he crossed the kitchen and took her hands and looked at her with an expression she had never seen before on any human face, something that combined terrified and joyful in proportions that would have been funny if it had not also been the most sincere thing she had ever witnessed. "Are you well?" he asked. "Are you frightened? What do you need?" "I am very well," she said. "I am a little frightened, but the practical kind, not the despairing kind, and I need you to keep making the coffee because I need to sit down." He made the coffee. She sat down. They sat together in the early morning kitchen while the Texas spring came slowly through the windows, and they were quiet with it, this new enormous thing that was happening inside the life they had been building. "It will be a lot of work," she said finally. "Yes. We will have to rethink the division of labor on the ranch. We will. I do not intend to stop working the operation because I am with child. I know. I am just telling you now so there is no misunderstanding later, Clara." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. "I know who you are. I have known who you are for 3 years. I am not going to change my mind about who you are because you are pregnant." She looked at his hand on hers. "Some men do. Some men are fools," he said. She turned her hand over and held his. "I know you are not one of them," she said. "I just needed to say it out loud." "Then say it whenever you need to. That is what I am here for." Thomas Aaron Pruitt was born in November of 1880 in the same bedroom of the Holt ranch house where Clara had slept since she was 22 years old. He arrived in the world with an opinion about the process, and expressed it loudly and at length, which the midwife, a woman named Rosa who had delivered half the babies in Callow Creek over 30 years, said was an excellent sign. Mason held his son for the first time in the hour after dawn, standing in the pale morning light coming through the window, and the look on his face was the same look he had in the barn with December the foal. The look of someone who finds a particular moment genuinely wonderful, except multiplied by everything a human life contains. Clara watched him from the bed, exhausted and clear-headed in the strange way that follows great physical effort, and loved him with a completeness that she suspected was going to continue surprising her for the rest of her life. Thomas Aaron learned to walk in the spring of 1882. Which coincided with a significant expansion of the combined ranch operation following Clara's successful negotiation with Samuel Finch over the western pasture land. The Finch deal had been exactly what she described to Mason on the porch that first summer evening. Clear, fair, and conducted with full knowledge of who had arranged the introduction, which had produced exactly the result she had predicted. The Holt Pruitt operation, which was what it was called in county records and association documents, and what Clara had insisted on with the same patient stubbornness she brought to every principle she believed in, was by 1882 one of the largest and most well-regarded ranches in the Texas Panhandle. It was known for fair labor practices, primarily because Clara ran the labor side of the operation and her standards in that area were non-negotiable, and for cattle quality, primarily because of the breeding program she had been developing since before she and Mason were married. Esteban and Lewis had both been formally recognized as senior foremen with wages that reflected their actual contributions, a status they accepted with the dignity of men who had been waiting for the world to catch up to something they had known for years. The arguments between Clara and Mason continued, because Clara was right that real partnership required real arguments, and because Mason had kept his promise to tell her when she was wrong. He was right about her being wrong approximately 15% of the time, which was her own estimation and therefore probably generous. The remaining 85% of their disagreements went in her favor, which was either evidence of her exceptional judgment or evidence of his exceptional listening. And she had decided it was both. The argument about the stock barn roof in the spring of 1883 was a good example. She wanted to replace the entire structure. He thought the eastern wall could be repaired at a third of the cost. She laid out her case for replacement in terms of long-term cost efficiency. He made his case for repair in terms of immediate cash flow. They argued for an entire evening at the kitchen table, while Thomas sat under the table playing with a toy horse and paying no attention. At the end of it, Mason said, "You are right about the long-term numbers. I am right about this year's cash flow. We are both right, and we are going to have to find a third option." They found a third option. They replaced the eastern wall and the roof structure, but kept the existing framing on the 3 solid walls, which achieved the long-term integrity Clara wanted at a cost closer to what Mason had calculated was feasible. She had entered the argument prepared to win. She had left it with something better than winning. "This," she told Martha Geary, "is the thing they do not tell you about marriage. Sometimes the argument you think you want to win is less valuable than the argument you have together." Martha, who had been married to Frank for 22 years, said, "I have been trying to explain that to women for 2 decades. You are the first one who figured it out before I finished the sentence." In the fall of 1883, Clara was pregnant again, and this time she told Mason in the barn rather than the kitchen, because she was checking on December, who was now 5 years old and in foal herself, and because it seemed somehow appropriate. Mason looked from her to the horse and back again with an expression that was equal parts delighted and slightly overwhelmed. "December is having a foal," he said. "In the spring, so am I, approximately the same time. We are going to have a very full spring." "We are going to have a very full life," she said, and there was no question in it. Eleanor Grace Pruitt was born in April of 1884, on the same day that December delivered her own foal, a sorrel colt that Thomas, who was 3½ and very decisive, named Wednesday in the spirit of family tradition. Eleanor arrived more quietly than her brother had, which the midwife Rosa said was also an excellent sign, as there were no universal rules about these things. She had Mason's gray eyes and Clara's dark hair, and from her very earliest weeks she had a quality of focused attention that Clara recognized immediately, and that made her laugh every time she saw it. "She is looking at me the way you look at everything," she told Mason. "Is that bad?" "It is," Clara said, studying her daughter's small, serious face, "the most wonderful thing I have ever seen." The Holt Pruitt ranch held. Through the hard years, and the dry years and the years when cattle prices broke and the market was brutal, and 2 of their neighbors sold out to speculators and left the county, the Holt Pruitt ranch held. Because they had planned for the hard years, because they had the water infrastructure and the breeding program and the fair labor practices that kept their best people through the lean times, and because the 2 people at the center of it had an operating partnership that had been tested against reality for long enough to know where it was strong. Clara ran the breeding program and the association work and the labor relations and the financial planning. Mason ran the daily operations and the land management and the equipment and the relationship with the livestock inspector's office, which remained friendly with Harlan Pruitt for many years. They disagreed about things regularly and agreed about more. They made decisions together that neither of them would have made alone, and most of those decisions were better for it. Thomas grew into a serious, patient child who loved animals and numbers in equal measure, and who had a quality his teacher at the Callow Creek School described as unusual in a child of his age: the ability to listen to both sides of a question before forming an opinion. Clara knew where he had learned that, and was proud of it in a way that was beyond words. Eleanor grew into a small, fierce person with her mother's certainty and her father's steadiness, who at the age of 4 corrected Esteban's addition in a ledger calculation, and was correct, which Esteban recounted at dinner tables in Callow Creek for the rest of his life. In the summer of 1886, when Thomas was 5 and Eleanor was 2, and the operation was running well, and the drought had broken and the grass was the best it had been in a decade, Clara was sitting on the porch in the evening, and Mason came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat beside her, and they watched the caprock go to copper in the fading light the way they had been watching it together for 7 years. "I want to tell you something," she said. "All right. I know why you let me win those arguments at the beginning, and I understand it now better than I did when I first figured it out." She paused. "You were not protecting me from losing. You were making room for me to be heard." He was watching her. In that world, in those years, a woman arguing about water rights and fence lines and association proposals was doing something that required more than being right. She required being believed. And you could not make the men in that room believe me, but you could make the argument go on record as correct by agreeing with it, and that is what you did. He was very quiet. "That is a specific and deliberate act of love," she said. "Not the romantic kind, the practical kind. The kind that costs something." "It cost nothing," he said. "You were usually right. I was not always right. No, but when you were wrong, it was not the kind of wrong that needed a public correction, and when you were right, it needed to be heard." She held her coffee cup and looked at the sky and thought about a girl who had arrived in Callow Creek with a deed and a coffin and a list of enemies, and had found, without expecting it, and without quite knowing when it happened, a place where she was listened to by the person who mattered most. "I love you," she said. "I love you in a way that has grown every single year, and I do not think it is going to stop." "Good," he said, "because I started in October of '77 and I have not stopped for a single day." She leaned her head on his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and they sat on the porch of the Holt ranch house, which was their home now in every sense that mattered, in the evening of a summer day in Callow Creek, Texas. While inside the house, their children slept, and outside the house the land they had fought for and built together lay quiet in the last of the light. December, now 8 years old and grazing in the south pasture with Wednesday at her side, lifted her head briefly in the direction of the porch, as if confirming that all was well. It was. Some years later, when Thomas was old enough to notice things and ask about them, he asked his mother how she had known that his father was the right person to love. Clara thought about it for a while. She thought about the water rights and the blue cotton and the December morning in the barn and the courthouse hallway, and all the arguments she had walked into with her fire and her preparation and her certainty, and the man who had been on the other side of every one of them, listening as though what she said was the most important thing happening in the world. "He heard me," she said. "From the very first day he heard me, not just the words, everything underneath them." She paused. "That is rare. When you find it, you know." Thomas considered this with the focused patience that had always been his most characteristic quality. "And that is enough?" He asked. "That," his mother said, "is everything." Mason was in the other room and probably heard some portion of this through the open door, but he did not say anything, which was also characteristic. He would tell her later in the evening that she had answered perfectly, And she would say she was aware of that, and they would both be right, and neither of them would be keeping score. They never had been. The Holt-Pruitt ranch ran for many more years after that. Through the changes that came with the closing of the open-range era and the difficult transitions of the late 1880s and into the 1890s, when the Panhandle changed, and the cattle business changed, and everything that had been frontier became something else. They adapted, as they had always adapted, together, through argument and agreement, and the particular kind of trust that is built not from never disagreeing, but from knowing that the other person will always listen. Thomas went to agricultural college in 1899 and came home with ideas about soil management that Esteban, now in his 60s and semi-retired, listened to with great patience and mostly approved of. Eleanor, who had her mother's instinct for argument and her father's timing, became the first woman admitted to the Callow Creek Cattlemen's Association as a full voting member in 1902. At the age of 18, a battle that Clara guided from behind, and Eleanor fought in the open, which was how it should be. Mason was 63 in 1910, and still rode the boundary fence every week, not because he needed to, but because it was where he did his best thinking, and because the land had been under his hands for 40 years, and he knew every foot of it the way a person knows their own family. Clara was 60 in 1912, and still attended every association meeting, and still kept the joint operating agreement current with any changes in law or circumstance, and still made the best use of the county recorder's office of anyone in the county. And still, on the occasions when she and Mason found themselves on opposite sides of a question, engaged in arguments that their grandchildren would later describe as some of the best entertainment of their childhood. She did not always win those arguments anymore. He had kept his promise. When she was wrong, he told her. She was wrong with roughly the frequency that any person of strong opinion and good intelligence is wrong, which is less often than their enemies say and more often than they would prefer. She had learned to lose an argument to Mason Pruitt with the same dignity she had once brought to winning one. It turned out that was harder. It also turned out to be one of the finest things she had ever learned. On an evening in October of 1912, 33 years after they had stood at her corral fence in the June sunshine, and she had told him to come around to her side of it, they sat on the porch of the Holt ranch house in the autumn dark, the way they had been sitting on that porch for most of their adult lives. The caprock was invisible in the darkness now, but they both knew exactly where it was. She had her coffee. He had his. Thomas was somewhere in the north pasture dealing with a fence situation. Eleanor was in Amarillo for a meeting of the Women's Reform Association, which she was secretary of, a position she had held for 3 years. The world was very quiet around them. "I want to tell you something," she said. "All right. I have been thinking about that first year. The water rights argument, when I rode up to your yard with a deed and a speech, and you just agreed with me before I had even started. I remember. I rode away thinking I had won," she said, "and I had not understood anything. You understood more than you gave yourself credit for. I understood the argument. I did not understand what it meant that you agreed." She paused. "I was so busy looking for the trap that I could not see the gift." He was quiet beside her, his shoulder warm against hers in the October cool. "You were so afraid of being managed," he said gently. "After everything you had been through, it was completely reasonable to look for the trap. I found it eventually," she said. "The trap was that you were going to love me for the rest of my life, and I was going to love you back, and there was no getting out of it." He laughed, the real laugh she had been making him do for 33 years, the one she had learned was rarer than it looked and worth protecting. "That," he said, "is exactly the trap." She took his hand in the dark. His hands were older now, rougher, the hands of a man who had worked the same hard land for half a century, and she knew every scar on them. "I would have walked into it a year earlier," she said, "if I had been paying better attention." "You were paying perfect attention," he said. "You were paying attention to everything that mattered. You needed to know who I was before you could trust what I was offering. That took the time it took. You never minded the waiting." "I minded it a great deal," he said, "but I minded the alternative more." She held his hand in the October dark, and thought that the best things in her life had come from being listened to, and that she had been lucky beyond all reasonable expectation to find, in a man across a fence line in a hard country, someone for whom listening was the most natural thing in the world. The caprock was out there in the dark. December's descendants were in the south pasture. The Holt Pruitt ranch, both names, ran to the horizon in every direction. She had won the argument that mattered most, which was the argument for her right to be heard. And the man beside her had known, from the very beginning, that it was an argument she should never have had to make. That was the only thing she had ever needed him to concede. He had conceded it every day for 33 years, not because she had demanded it, but because he had known from the first moment. He saw her reading a survey marker in the rain that she was someone whose voice deserved to fill every room she walked into. The truth of it settled around them in the October evening, warm and specific and completely their own. She finished her coffee. He kept hold of her hand. The ranch held through the night, as it always had. And in the morning there would be new things to do and new arguments to have and new ground to cover. But right now there was just this: the porch, the dark, the caprock somewhere beyond the edge of seeing, and the two of them still here, still together, still exactly where they were supposed to be.